Can you see the slides now?
Yep, you're on the floor.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever to everybody. This is kind of interesting. I'm going to go through two different kind of sessions. The first is what the Public Safety Spectrum Alliance is trying to do to retain 100% use of the 4.9 spectrum for public safety. That's an organization that I belong to, and I belong to another organization, which Alan Tillis mentioned, which is the Government Wireless Telecommunications Association, and their opportunity rests on, if we lose the spectrum, how do we work with the states to ensure that the spectrum is doled out properly so that public safety has access to it. So I'm going to go through these things. The slides are already up and available if anybody wants them. What's happened here is really interesting. Everything has happened very quickly. You may know that we were given, public safety was given in 2002, 50 megahertz of 4.9 spectrum. And that was partly as a direct result of the 9/11 attacks. And it was to be licensed to public space safety agencies. It was a band that was set up like Wi-Fi operation for mobile and later fixed devices. One of the issues that we have is that when the FCC issued the band to public safety, they only require geographic licensing. So if you go to the FCC ULS database and you look around the database, you don't really get a true idea of how many users there are on the spectrum. And there are lots. There are lots more that, because the geographic licenses don't require how many base stations, how many portables, how many mobiles, you have no indication of how many users in every geographic area. It's used very heavily by many agencies for a variety of purposes, and I'll get into that. And as I said, the actual number of users, we don't know. The FCC, when they issued the spectrum, had primary use cases and secondary use cases. You can see it was designed like a Wi-Fi system with mesh networks and Wi-Fi hotspots and voice over IP, temporary and permanent communications. And then the secondary user cases were permanent fixed point-to-point, multi-point links that deliver narrowband traffic. Well, and also higher bandwidth traffic. What's happened today, there are a number of areas in Oregon, Chicago, New York, and other places where 4.9 is the backhaul for a lot of fixed cameras. And this is one of the issues we have with that, because we have to figure out what we're going to do with these people if we truly lose the spectrum. So here's the rule that created it. Existing users are rough approximates. As I said, the FCC gave us the spectrum in 2002. We never really had any usable equipment for a full year. And then what we had was for local area use, not point to point. The FCC's database says there are 3,200 licenses. We believe that there are a lot more licenses than that, and there are certainly a lot more devices. So they changed the licensing at one point to say, if you're going to put up point-to-point or point-to-multi-point, you need to license each location. But in many cases, talking to people who have point-to-point up and running, they never went back and modified their licenses. So this was the frequency band plan. And if you look at the top of it, they said you could aggregate these channels into 5, 10, 15, or 20 megahertz of spectrum, depending on the amount of bandwidth you need. So today, there are all kinds of systems out there, some of which are 1 megahertz, 2 megahertz, some of which are 5, some of which are 15. There's a couple of 20s. Now, what's interesting is the spectrum was used by public safety, and about 2018, somebody at the FCC woke up and said, wait, we don't think there's enough usage on that band. There's only 3,200 users in the entire country, which of course was a faulty decision. Their contention was that public safety is not using this spectrum in large numbers. Part of that issue is the way the band was licensed, as I said. And since 2018, some interesting things have happened. There have been a lot of public safety agencies that I've been working with that want to put fixed cameras up and other devices for simulcast backhaul and things like that. But because the FCC started mucking around with the spectrum in 2018, very few users have come forward to license it because they don't know what the FCC is doing. And frankly, I don't think until recently the FCC knew what it was doing. So they were already considering opening the band for other types of users. Utilities, wireless internet service providers, if any of you know the organization WISPA, they're doing a lot of good things in rural America. But those people are the ones who are going to underlay our microwave band on 6 gigahertz. So there's an issue there. So the question we wanted to answer was, how do you protect existing 4.9 users who are mostly point-to-point at this point? And can the band be configured to serve existing users and new technology users? And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And what types of devices will be needed for 4.9 gigahertz if there's a shift in technology? So the first question is, can the FCC be stopped from doling out this spectrum to the states? And if not, why not? Actually, I got a little ahead of myself because what we looked at the Public Safety Spectrum Alliance, and I'll talk about that in a minute, was how do you repurpose most of 4.9 and leave segments for existing users? Now, none of these ideas have been implemented. These are simply ideas. One was to divide the band and use 5G for frequency division duplex, which is what we have now, uplink and downlink, and that would give us 10 megahertz of spectrum in the middle, which we could use for existing 4.9 users. It would be very difficult to add that 10 megahertz back into 5G, but there are other ways it can be used. Another way is to use time division duplex, which is also an LTE and a 5G technology. You might recall Sprint's 2.5 gigahertz, 2.5 spectrum is TDD, or time division duplex. And in that case, we could phase in with 30 megahertz for TDD and leave 20 megahertz for existing 4.9 users, or we could configure 40 megahertz and 10 megahertz. And again, these are not, they're just ideas that we came up with. And there's some other technology solutions that nobody's really looked at in depth. But this led to the founding of the Public Safety Spectrum Alliance, and that ended up in some action from the FCC. So I'm sure you all know that the Public Safety Alliance, which I was part of, worked with Congress and the executive branch and the FCC to get FirstNet. During the summer of this year, many of the PSA members met and discussed issues facing public safety and 4.9 spectrum. The result was a formation of the Public Safety Spectrum Alliance, the PSSA.org, And we've received strong support from many public safety agencies and organizations, and we're always looking for more. The goal of the PSSA is to convince the FCC to assign all 50 megahertz of that spectrum to public safety. One suggestion was that the FCC license it to the FirstNet Authority, not FirstNet AT&T, but the FirstNet Authority. And there's a big difference to that. And by the way, bulk licensing has a history, because if you recall, the Public Safety Spectrum Trust, which was run by Harlan McEwen, was granted a nationwide license for the first 10 megahertz of FirstNet. And after Congress passed the FirstNet, the FCC then issued all 20 megahertz of the license to the FirstNet Authority. We're not saying that this is the end all be all. We're saying here's an idea. And as a group of public safety people, we want to discuss what we should do here. So the purpose of the Public Safety Alliance is to ensure that responders nationwide are able to use the most technology advanced communications capabilities. And the goal is to raise awareness at the FCC, Congress, and the White House. There's a website posting, which is a petition that we ask people to sign. And there's a statement here of why the 4.9 spectrum is important to public safety for however it's going to be used. And there's another issue here, of course, which is that since 2018, it's been in limbo. What's interesting to me, after the formation of the PSSA, somebody woke up at the FCC and said, let's go ahead and do something about this. And if you read the comments, and I've read as many of them as I can on the 6 NPRNs, I haven't read every one. Alan Tillis has read a bunch of them too. But we can't find anything that says, let's license this to the states and let the states lease it out to whomever they want. But this is what they're planning to do on the 30th of September. It's a rulemaking, followed by another notice of proposed rulemaking beyond that. There are lots of users. San Bernardino County, California, by the way, Tim Traeger is on the GWTCA board with me, and he's concerned they have localized use of 4.9 there. And again, the first licenses were geographic and not based on the number of stations and mobiles. It's not possible to really tell how many people we have on the users. So after the PSSA became active, the FCC chairman wrote a blog about what was going to happen on September 30th, 2020 at the meeting. And one of those was a rule that would issue the spectrum to the states with quote unquote some protection for existing licensed users. That's something I have a real problem with. Each state will be able to lease its spectrum to a master license holder, and the leaseholder will then determine how the spectrum will be used. Well, if a state licenses it to a master leaseholder who decides that they're going to use the spectrum for 5G and use all of it, for example, and lease it to other people, which they can do, what protection is there really for public safety? So this is the blog that the chairman wrote, and the bottom line is that it's interesting, the Public Safety Spectrum Alliance, as I said earlier, we're focused on trying to get this rulemaking taken off the agenda for September 30th. The GWTCA is more involved in, if the votes are there and we lose the spectrum to the states, then how does the WTCA help the states to help public safety. So as Alan said, there's a very, very good set of documents up on the GWTCA site that explain what's going on. But there are some real issues here either way. Here's a little bit about what the further notice would do. Voluntary state band managers to coordinate and authorize, seek comment on additional ways to implement and facilitate. But none of this makes sense, because if there is a leaseholder, master leaseholder, basically they can do what they want with the spectrum. My issues with this is radio waves don't stop at state borders. Boy, I'll tell you, the people in Southern California know that really well. Rulemaking does not seem to give any guidance regarding common technologies state to state that could also impact interference issues. Existing public safety agencies are grandfathered in, but no new public safety licenses will be issued. And again, I have a question about how do you grandfather something in when there's a leaseholder who wants to make money on the spectrum. Ruling does not seem to provide on how to protect grandfathered public safety agencies, and how would the state master leaseholders protect the public safety agencies? What incentive would they have if they can lease spectrum to others and make money? The entire process seems to be aimed at moving forward before current commissioners resign and head for their next more lucrative jobs. I want to leave you with this final statement, and I'll take questions if there's time, but this is a statement that the PCCA put out, and it basically says the public safety community right now is engaged in so many different fronts: COVID-19, horrendous wildfires, abnormal number of hurricanes, civil unrest and rioting and looting. Yet this month, with all of that going on, the FCC commissioners plan to take away 50 megahertz of spectrum that we are going to need in the very near future. There's a hashtag on Twitter that's "What's the Rush?" I want to make one more comment here, which may not be politically correct, but I have to wonder, since the current president is running for re-election under a law and order banner, how then can his chairman of the FCC ignore that and take spectrum away from public safety? And I am done at this point.